I can't prove it. It's Monday, January 20th, 2020, and this is the Delta CX podcast. And today's topic is empathy. So many questions about that. And we have a returning guest, the very popular and well loved Dr. Seth Finkle. And as usual, I'm going to let you introduce yourself while I open up all the windows that let me chat with all of the fans.
Excellent. Well, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you happen to be. I am Seth Finkle. I'm a clinical and school psychologist working out of the Lehigh Valley in Pennsylvania in the United States of America, and hope that things are good with you wherever you happen to be. Looking forward to another exciting chat with Deb and the UX/CX world.
I'm nothing if not exciting. So thank you so much for joining. I'm praying my power doesn't go out and my Wi-Fi doesn't blip. We have a terrible storm here. But as usual, for those listening, this is no ads, no sponsors. So I have nothing to plug you now other than me. So we wanted to talk about empathy. And for those of you who have read the book, and of course, I just happen to have a book here to show you. For those of you who have read the Delta CX book, you may feel like you know Seth. He was interviewed early on in the book about this very topic, but there's been such a great, warm, positive response to that interview that I wanted to bring Seth on for a live conversation. And as always, take your questions. So please remember that we are live right now if you're listening live. And we're happy to take your questions related to empathy. We have a bunch of topics we're ready to discuss, but this is, as usual, live and unscripted. And Seth, I have learned we are allowed to say swear words because I've marked this as not for children.
Excellent. Okay.
Just so you know, this doesn't mean go off on the whole thing.
Yeah,
but
I immediately did not respond by dropping the F-bomb, although I could have, but I didn't.
Right. Don't go into George Carlin's. Yeah, don't get George Carlin's words you can't say on television. So, Seth, I want to start quite simply with, as a psychologist, and again, you don't work in UX or CX, but you are definitely a dude who knows a few things about psychology, given your bachelor's degree and your PsyD and your work. What would you say is the definition of empathy?
Right. So empathy is one of those things that everybody knows, and yet nobody knows what the definition is because it's just one of those. The problem with almost all psychological constructs is that there's no great definition. But to get us rolling, at least, there's often a distinction that's made between things like empathy and sympathy and compassion. And it's usually easier to describe empathy by talking about kind of what it is and what it isn't. To complicate things even more right now, there's, as you've sent me, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's out there about various flavors of empathy and subtypes of empathy. And I'm not sure how much of that I buy, but we'll go there later. So for starters, empathy
is... It's pin the tail on the donkey.
Exactly. Empathy is kind of walking in someone else's shoes. The best descriptions I've ever read are somewhat abstract and a little esoteric, frankly. It has to do with, so sympathy is the simpler one. Sympathy is being able to kind of vaguely imagine what someone else might be going through, but you're still experiencing it from your perspective, from your point of view. It doesn't bring you out of your own experience. So I can hear that something bad happened to you and go, oh, that's too bad. That's ostensibly sympathy. If I'm imagining what you're feeling and I'm beginning to experience feelings that are somewhat in resonance with yours, they're somewhat similar to yours, what I imagine yours might be, and I'm beginning to physically experience that emotion, now we're talking about empathy, where you're literally, for lack of a less abstract phrase, you're kind of transcending yourself and sort of...
You're picking up someone's vibes and you're living them.
Vibe. Yeah, there's something kind of mystical and spiritual about the idea of empathy in a lot of ways. You're...
Can I sing Age of Aquarius as you go on?
You can. You were doing it before, so feel free. You were presupposing what we were going to be talking about. Um,
Woo woo. Well, I am that empathy person. I mean, I know that sounds woo woo and maybe I'll get hate mail, but I am that weird person who picks up on other people's feelings and feels them myself. Not everybody and not all the time, but I know I can tell, like, wow, this is not my feeling, this is not my emotion, this is not my perception. I'm picking up on somebody else's. And that sounds like a textbook definition of empathy.
yeah, I would agree. It's really beginning to experience what you perceive to be the other person's emotional experience.
So let's take a look at one of the links I had sent you was someone breaking empathy into three different types.
Right.
This model had cognitive empathy, it had emotional empathy, and it had compassionate empathy. This was found on a website called skillsyouneed.com. Now, again, I'm not saying I don't know these people. I don't know if I would necessarily agree or disagree with them, but let's take a look at their model and see if it helps us make sense of all of this. It says cognitive empathy, also known as perspective taking, is not really what most of us would think of as empathy at all. Okay, well, then maybe it's not empathy. Yeah, thing one. It says cognitive empathy is basically being able to put yourself into someone else's place and see their perspective. So it's a little bit different than what we talked about feeling their feelings. But an interesting example the website gives is that someone who wrote a book about emotional intelligence noted that torturers would need to have good cognitive empathy to figure out how to best hurt someone, but certainly we wouldn't think of them as sympathetic or even necessarily empathetic. Anything in this definition you want to clear up, and does the psychology community make these distinctions?
Sure. Yeah. So they do, or at least those people who really kind of get down and kind of into the empathy thing. There are some people who really focus more on it than others in terms of the terminology and kind of the inner workings of it. There's a lot of psychologists in the community who would simply talk about empathy as a thing and not necessarily feel the need to kind of parse it in that way. Um, but sure. So Daniel Goleman, who's the guy who wrote a book on emotional intelligence, wrote the book on emotional intelligence, literally called emotional intelligence. Kind of coined the term and created the whole notion of it. And he certainly speaks quite a bit about kind of the importance of empathy as a basic human skill. And it's true that you can, psychologists are famous really for, maybe we could say notorious for kind of unpacking terminology into smaller and smaller bits of jargon. So yeah, I think it might be a useful distinction to talk about the cognitive component versus the emotional component. The compassionate empathy seems to me to be not so much a third type as a kind of balance of the two. And it's most important when you're looking at the function of empathy, what it's for. Because arguably, I mean, empathy by itself isn't always a helpful thing. Some of the examples given about emotional empathy are things that are actually the risks of working in a helping profession like mine. And frankly, if you go overboard, I suppose you could be experiencing some of that in UX, CX, I guess. It seems like there's at least some risk of that you over-identify with the person emotionally, and you have difficulty.
You take your work home.
You do, and it starts to work on you after a while, and that's not always a good thing. So the idea of a kind of intellectualized process sounds more like kind of what the risk, the greater risk would be in your business, which would be the idea of kind of an under emotional cognitive. I think this might be what the person is experiencing, the user is experiencing, or the customer is experiencing, without actually really putting yourself in their shoes. And that's maybe helpful, but probably it might be necessary, but not sufficient. The emotional part of it is when you talk about the Four Horsemen, registered trademark.
Thanks.
I
just had someone infringe it last week, so thanks for saying that.
I got to do it. So I read your stuff, so I know that's a thing. But the Four Horsemen, I mean, the whole concept of frustration is that if you're going to help someone with that frustration, you have to understand it emotionally as well. It helps to be frustrated when you're doing that. If you simply go, gee, that must suck, that's not so helpful. So yeah, I think the cognitive versus the emotional aspects of it are probably pretty useful in a lot of different ways.
And I think when we think about our industry, even if someone is exhibiting that cognitive empathy where they have an awareness of what someone else's experience might be, where someone in our companies might say, well, it looks like it's really difficult for people to get that done, or it looks like we're getting some complaints about that thing, but we don't want to spend the money on it. They'll figure it out. They mostly love us anyway. And so I think that we can't just abandon empathy at, did you kind of see something through someone's eyes and kind of take their perspective? Because if we're not then sympathetic, compassionate, or taking action, I think your empathy is probably pretty meaningless.
Agreed.
And you can disagree with me, by the way.
No, I agree with you completely. I think so. In your field and in mine, there's somewhat different responses to that kind of emotion that the person is having, that kind of experience that they're having. But there's the common ground, I would think, is that we're trying to help someone. We're trying to get them past that stumbling block or that difficulty that they're having. We do that in potentially different ways, but the bottom line is we are able to identify the experience that they're having and recognize the importance of changing that in some way for them, and then applying some kind of force to make that happen to the system. And that may be to the individual's personality, it might be to their life circumstances or their environment, it might be to the application that they're working on. But yeah, no, I agree with you. The whole idea of if you can simply say, oh gee, that's rough, that person is out there in 18-degree Fahrenheit weather shivering in the cold, that must really suck to be them, and then you walk on and not do something about it, arguably that's not super helpful.
No, and you may have done perspective taking, and maybe someone even gave you a certificate in empathy, but congratulations, you're still kind of a dick.
Exactly.
I
Yeah,
don't know if they give certificates for that.
Now you've used your adult warning on YouTube. Congratulations.
I know. We've said some stronger words here. In general, I try not to curse too much, but there's just a couple of words that only have good replacements in Italian. So that was one thing that I ran into, was this idea of cognitive empathy versus emotional or compassionate. And emotional and compassionate sounded like people who were so moved by someone else's experience and maybe starting with that perspective taking them, but then being so moved by it that they had to do something. They had to act. And in our businesses, maybe that's starting with a conversation. It doesn't mean you go and tear down walls of servers, but you start by having a conversation about those needs. But then when I see cognitive empathy and I think about what's going on in our industry, and again, all these people getting certificates in empathy and certificates in design thinking, where step one is create empathy. I'm feeling like we've really watered this down into something that it people say, oh, well, it's just seeing things through other people's eyes. Yeah, but I feel like that's also that could be faked and plastic.
Right. And there's some connection between, and arguably no one really fully understands it at this point, some connection between one's personality and the way in which one kind of plays out this sort of empathy, the way in which they experience it and they react to it. You had also shown me had sent me something that I'm not going to lie, I kind of chuckled at a little bit.
The 7 styles of empathy.
Yeah, which
I'm going there now. Yeah,
greatly resembled the much beloved Myers-Briggs,
or Enneagram.
Has or Enneagram, where there's quite a few of these things, which has about as much scientific basis. Arguably, the Myers-Briggs, maybe more than the Enneagram, has at least a little bit of scientific underpinning. So for those people who are out there who have done research on the Myers-Briggs, sorry, but arguably it's not exactly super robust, and certainly at best we can say it's highly controversial in terms of how much kind of strong statistical psychometric underpinning it has, and how much of it is just stuff that seems convenient and we like. And so we kind
And
of,
we have to remember that, we experience this in UX, and I'm sure you experience this in psychology. There are things that have gotten out as a psychological construct or model, or a pseudo psychological construct or model, and you guys don't use it. So, for example, someone's out there going, "Oh, Myers-Briggs. Oh, what type are you? Oh, Enneagram," and you're thinking, "We don't use that."
right. Right.
I've never walked up to a psychologist and had him say, "And what Myers-Briggs type are you?"
Well, so funnily enough, there are certain groups of sort of subgroups of psychologists who it's hard to tell how much this is being used ironically versus how much is being used seriously, but there are quite a few who will sort of identify themselves as a particular type. And so, they're like, hey, INFJ, and okay, great, terrific for you. It's just not entirely clear what to do with that information.
Yeah, now what? Right.
The whole notion of, well, that means I should only be paired with, an ENFP or something like that in the workplace. That's preposterous. It's going far beyond the merits of the concept. So the same thing I think is true with these sort of empathy subtypes. Back in the day, there were leadership types. People were like, "What animal are you?"
Sure.
Avoid being the pigeon. That's always bad, or the seagull. But I'm not sure that.
In UX, someone said, like, "Don't be a unicorn, be a hedgehog." I'm like, what does that even mean? My dog kills hedgehogs. I don't want to be an animal that's easily killed.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, these are ideas that I suppose have some merit if you're working in an organization that has absolutely zero psychological mindedness, and they need to start talking about the concept of human psychology in some way,
and find labels for people.
Right. It's a very easy way of being able to categorize and classify people. And I'm not so sure that that's useful to an organization that's progressive enough to actually give people the space to be themselves. So.
And just to fill in everybody else on the joke, because you and I are talking about something we've seen, but we haven't said it to the audience yet. So, and by the way, for those who are live, we are taking questions both on YouTube and on LinkedIn. So if you have questions about empathy in the workplace, creating empathy, ask them. We'd love to answer them. So I found this webpage on a site called empathystyles.com, claiming that they have found a model that is, their model is 7 styles of empathy that supposedly explain non-rational behavior, which already sounds a little judgmental, but their styles are normal, which already I have a problem with. I'm sorry. That's it. I'm already angry. The hustler, the mover, the double checker, the artist, the politician, and the engineer. And my thought when I saw this was, wow, this has nothing to do with empathy. This is just another model that tries to break people and their behaviors and preferences into some sort of spectrum or whack-a-mole of styles. This really has nothing to do with empathy. And I'm reading stuff like, the hustler will drive for material success, enjoying money. They're quick, opportunistic, shrewd, entrepreneurial, and charming. Like, this isn't an empathy style. This is just trying to lump people into buckets. Seth.
Yeah. So I had to squint and read the article through the side of my eye with peripheral vision to be able to even spot anything that looked like empathy. It was
okay.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 150%. I immediately leapt to kind of these sort of quasi pseudoscientific categorization or classification systems that have been around for 75 years at this point, and felt that this was absolutely one of them as opposed to a meaningful. I would love to see, or probably would not love to see, the scientific background that allowed them to come up with these 7 factors. I'm guessing
we asked 7 people in my family.
Yes, I'm guessing there was no factor analysis that was done in this process. No stats were harmed.
Not peer reviewed.
Right.
No stats were harmed.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not so sure there's anything to it other than what it read like to me was, hey, here's an idea. Let's take those cool kind of like older systems of thinking about personality, and let's take this new buzzword of empathy and let's mash them together and see
Ooh,
if we can
I
make a
like
buck
it.
on it.
That's right, because this company is selling training and train the trainer and all that stuff. So I've been saying to people, design thinking, design sprints, empathy, monster cottage industries right now making people a lot of money, which is why not a lot of people are speaking out against them. They're making too much money right now.
Right. I mean, everyone
I
loves a
wanted
buzzword.
go ahead.
Everyone
Yeah.
loves a buzzword. And if you can give 7 cool buzzwords to your organization at the highest possible level, and then everyone can talk about those and they can laugh about, hey, I'm a mover and a shaker, I'm a hustler, and someone else going, well, then you probably
I'm type
shouldn't,
A.
you shouldn't work with Jane, like, I mean, whatever. I mean,
She's
okay.
sloth-like.
Yeah, right.
She's
Like,
sloth-like and shakes a lot less.
she won't be able to understand you because her level of empathy is different than your type of empathy. Whatever. I mean, okay, if that works for someone, great. I'm just not seeing that there's going to be a whole lot of value for your average. I'm thinking a typical Fortune 500 company might see through some of that crap.
It sounds like a path to a lawsuit. Like, wow, they didn't put me on a certain project, or they didn't pair me with someone, or I didn't get upgraded as a manager because someone thought I was empathy type politician, and that somehow doesn't fit with a thing. Um, there was something else I was going to tell a little story at this point, and I don't know if you've heard this one, but this to me is about empathy, and it's about so right now the big buzzword in UX and design is empathy. Have empathy, show empathy for customers, users, empathy. But every day, seemingly, okay, maybe not every day, it's an exaggeration. Quite often, for the last 20 something years, I receive emails from companies that I do business with that want to wish me a happy Mother's Day, that want to show me back to school specials and sales,
Mm-hmm.
that want to sell me something for my very special child. The example I used in my book was Wells Fargo. My own bank sent me something around August with a stock photo of a college age, about someone probably your son's age, like college age person in the laundromat on the phone begging parents for money. And it was this whole thing. And basically, the message of the email was your college age kid is going back to school. They need your money. Now, my thought was, okay, thing one, we're doing something wrong technologically. If everyone's throwing around AI and machine learning and all this, and my own bank doesn't know if I have a child or not, so that they could send me the proper email. Thing two, here's where empathy comes in. We can claim and we can hold meetings and we can put post-its on walls and we can say empathy. But if you send an email about back to school time, about happy Mother's Day to a man or woman or other who has lost a child, who was unable to have a child and struggles with that frequently, that is low empathy. That is, to me, that is cruel for us to not even bother to see if we are sending out an email that might actually be hurtful and ruin someone's day just because we think we're marketing and advertising.
Absolutely.
What
It's
do
a
you
great
think of that?
example. So I would see you and raise you in terms of the terminology. I don't think it's just low empathy. I think that's an empathic failure, and
Mm,
that's a thing. The idea that you can be low empathy and just have a hard time appreciating someone else's emotional response to something. That would be in a different category altogether. That's literally crossing a boundary and doing something that is going to produce the things that you're trying to fix, right? It's going to produce frustration or pain or some kind of negative experience in the person. It's going to literally induce that unnecessarily. And that's the fact that someone failed to recognize it. That might have been a low empathy person doing it. The fact that someone allowed that to be implemented, that ultimately results in an empathic failure where the person is no longer um, the end
see if
user,
I
the
can find it.
customer is no longer actually tuned in. You're going to potentially lose a customer over that, and that seems completely unnecessary.
Yeah, I mean, okay case scenario is that person just unsubscribes from your mailing list because they don't want to hear anything from your bank or your company out of the fear that you're going to bring up kids and Mother's Day and kids and kids and kids. In a worst case scenario, you are genuinely causing someone pain. You're ruining their day. You're bringing back thoughts or memories that they were finally able to temporarily let go of. And to me, that's an empathy failure. And when people tell me, they're always like, oh, machine learning, artificial intelligence. And I'm like, yeah, how come my bank hasn't figured out that I don't have kids? And
Right.
how come they're thinking, well, we'll just send this out to everybody? Because chances are Deb knows somebody who's a college age kid who wants her money. It's in the book. Let's see.
There you go.
It's a little hard to see. It's a little hard to see, but basically there's that college age girl in the laundromat and she needs my money.
Right.
And so, and I was reminded that someone my age would have college kids, which I am reminded of when I talk to you, Seth, because you
Right.
have college kids and we're nearly the
Sorry.
same age. Damn you.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, it's all your fault.
If it helps
so
any, I
my
look at my kids and they remind me of the same thing, so it's their fault.
right. What happened to me? Well, how am I not still 18? So I think that if we're going to talk about empathy in our companies, we need people, usually UX and CX people, who are going to be that shepherd and that guide and that check and balance. When marketing says, yeah, Deb's 47, Deb's going to be 48 this year, send her out an email about her college kids. If she doesn't have any, she probably has a sibling or a friend with college kids, and she's sending everybody her money. I think we have to get smarter. We have to stop putting people into demographic buckets. The world is too diverse. Our customers are too diverse, and I think it's too diverse to be sending these same old things the same old way based on the assumptions about demographics. And if it's hurtful to someone, then it's low empathy, in my opinion.
I agree. Now, this may be the only time I ever say this in the course of my life, but I'm going to say it anyway. So big data might be one of the solutions to this problem. Normally,
Oh, you'll be sorry.
I know, and I'm just full disclosure here. I am not a big data fan. So people who don't know me, I'm not. I'm getting nothing back from big data other than the fact that they're watching me say this right now. But having said
Hello,
that,
overlords.
yes, that's Coca-Cola, send me a check. I will. Now we have a sponsor. I will say that. So here's the thing, though. Big data has the capacity. They know whether you have kids.
They should.
They know all about that. And arguably, if someone were making smart use of the amount of available information that has been pried out of our lives at this point, that would be at least a way to use it that produces a more positive customer experience. Like take the gigabytes of information that are known about you or me, or any of the people who are listening or watching this right now, and or the overlords. Take all of that information about us and use that to craft an experience that doesn't necessarily steer us towards a product or service. I know you're trying to do that already. I get that. That's been made abundantly clear by all of the ads that pop up that clearly show that you've been looking over my shoulder. But how about instead of that creepy feeling, we get the feeling that you're doing something to kind of protect us from something that might be painful or uncomfortable by not showing Deb the stuff about back to school or about Mother's Day.
Oh, I'm fine with it. I'm just talking about other people because I have empathy for them.
Right. Well, and so there's so many people who have had difficult experiences. Back when I was doing more social media, I would inevitably try to send something out occasionally on, say, a Mother's Day or something like that, and say, that I'm thinking about the people or holding them in my heart who are having a hard time because of the fact that they lost a parent, or they have a fraught relationship with a parent, or they lost a child, or they have a difficult relationship with a child, or they've never had kids, or they don't want to have kids, or they wanted to have
You have
kids but
empathy.
couldn't have kids. Right. Like there's other experiences that can be out there. That may just be a cognitive empathy thing to recognize the existence of those people. I might have an emotional empathy experience because I'm feeling that might be painful for those people. the compassionate empathy part is I put a little something out there to say, hey, I'm thinking about you guys. You know, it's wanting to kind of reach out and do something to acknowledge that other person's experience, or in a better case scenario, if you can, to do something about it.
We have an interesting question in the chat room from friend of the show, Eugene, who I think is in the UK. And of course, hello to Julio, who always comes by. Eugene says, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the following statement. And this statement winds around a little bit, so put on that beanie.
Okay.
Empathy is a byproduct of a processed trauma, so it can be trained through managed micro stress, similar to athletes training their physical and mental abilities.
Well, that's interesting.
Thoughts?
Yeah. So I've not seen any research to support that theory or that hypothesis, but I like it. There's something very kind of there's something tidy about it, in the sense that it does kind of merge the ideas of trauma and empathy together. And I do think anecdotally, I've probably seen that from a number of people. Let me put it this way, in the most direct way that I can. I once worked with a social worker back probably 20 something years ago. She after a group that we ran, and both of us really struggled. It was an adolescent group. The kids were working us really hard. It was not the best group, I'm going to say, that session that we've ever led. And the kids left and they all went home, and it was just the two of us sitting there after the chaos had just started to die down, both stressed out. And she turned and looked at me and said, we're all damaged goods. And interestingly enough, we had a follow-up conversation, and she was talking about humans, but she was specifically talking about us, about mental health workers, about people working in helping professions. And it's almost a faux pas socially to ask someone how they got into the field of mental health, because essentially you're asking for their backstory, because inevitably—
What happened to you?
Right. Or what happened in your family, or what happened to your loved ones, or essentially what drove you to the madness of wanting to work in this profession. And that's not true of everyone, but it's true of a lot of people who work in a helping capacity, that usually there's some kind, or often there's some kind of, if not overt trauma, then certainly some kind of challenge that someone has had to cope with, struggle with, might still be coping with or struggling with in the course of their lives. And if I'm understanding the statement properly, that's kind of what I'm hearing, is that empathy may kind of be the phoenix that comes out of the ashes of trauma. And I think there's some truth to that. I think there's a more fundamental explanation, though, for empathy. And this is also theoretical, but this is a theory that I personally kind of like. And that is that empathy is largely also the byproduct of basic biology. It may be both.
I was going to ask, like, is the amount of empathy we're capable of mostly born into us and only expanded later through a lot of self-discovery, self-work, self-honesty?
So there's a lot of different points of view on this. Well, let me give you the short version of a couple. One of them is we can take it back to something like the concept of mirror neurons, which were discovered not super long ago. I don't remember precisely when, but I know most of the research on mirror neurons, which are a very specific type of nerve cell, really date back to kind of the early to mid 2000s. So we're talking about within the last roughly 10, 15 years tops. And people have been doing a fairly large number of experiments. There's a lot of research using brain imaging of various kinds, specifically using MRI and fMRI and EEG and stuff like that. And what they've shown is that there's certain parts of the brain that seem to produce a kind of mirror reaction in individuals when they're exposed to it. So if you're seeing a picture of someone in distress, or you're seeing a person in distress, you're more likely to experience the firing, the activation of those particular nerve cells. And these are areas like the anterior insula and the anterior cingulate and inferior frontal cortex, part of the frontal and kind of deep frontal lobes of the brain that process very particular kinds of emotion. So they first found this out in primates. And there's a lot of research in primates to show that this is a thing. They've just started to look at it in humans. But what it essentially says is, part of the reason we are able to learn the skills we can learn, if I see someone waving, there's a part of my brain as an infant or as a chimpanzee that recognizes that visual stimulus and that essentially primes my brain to engage in the same kind of behavior. Literally kind of mirroring what you're observing. And the same thing seems to hold true for emotion. So there's a thinking that there's something very hardwired about empathy that we learn from very early infancy, that if a mother smiles at an infant, that the infant is very likely to smile back, assuming that there isn't something different about them neurologically. We found that autism, for example, seems to be this is at least one hypothetical as well at this point that's being heavily researched, a kind of failure of these sorts of mirror neurons to do their job. And so that kind of mirroring experience doesn't seem to happen as early on. So that's one way of thinking about it, is that essentially we're primed to experience what other people are experiencing in a kind of normal state.
I love this stuff, but I don't want to get too in the weeds of psychology textbook stuff, because I know a lot of people listening are going to be like, but what the hell do I do at my stupid job when they're saying empathy again?
Right.
So was there something else you wanted to say that's super important? Not that something you're saying isn't important, but is it okay for me to bring this back around to UX?
Well, so the other thing I was going to say, I think is a little more relevant. So the idea is, there is a fair amount of research recently, and it's really intriguing research. And by recently, I mean in the last really 5 years or so, looking at producing empathy. So the question of, can empathy be created, or is it hardwired? And I would think that's probably of significant value in your industry. So the answer is yeah, you kind of can. There's actually pretty good data to suggest that, for example, when doctors go through med school, they actually experience a decrease in empathy. And there's training programs that have been created to kind of help doctors to remedy that. And they've been very effective. So there are definitely ways that you can help people to kind of tune into that emotional response and kind of amplify it a little bit, and then figure out what I can do with that to be more compassionate to people. So the idea is that some of this may be biological, but it doesn't mean that you're locked into it. If someone is low empathy, it doesn't mean they always have to be low empathy, but they need to be motivated by something to try to improve that. I would hope the motivation, if it isn't intrinsic to the individual, I would hope that the motivation might come from the desire to, say, do their job better. Actually help end users, help customers. That's kind of the point of the whole thing. If you want to do that well, it seems to me learning how to increase your level of empathy would be a really valuable thing to do. So I think that should be the sales pitch to really low empathy people in business at the moment is, you're holding yourself and your company back by not experiencing a little more of this from the customer's perspective.
Yeah, and then ultimately, what keeps coming back for me is, we can talk about empathy for the next 1,000 years, but if at our companies we don't have the right hierarchy, processes, whatever it is, in place to take action, all this empathy is just a bunch of Post-its on a wall that said, customers feel frustrated and they're thinking this doesn't work well and they're feeling this and they're wanting this. Congratulations, you put Post-its on a wall, someone got a certificate for something, everybody had a fun meeting, everyone ate the donuts. Now freaking do something.
Right. And that's really the nub of it, right? I mean, empathy is really a kind of self-gratifying experience if you don't actually apply it in some meaningful way. And that's it, and it's also something that can be easily faked. You can do a kind of quasi-empathic process and say, well, we empathized. And in that process, you meant, well, I sort of imagined what the other person's perspective might hypothetically be like, and then I just left it there and did nothing about that, or used it to kind of craft an experience that manipulated them in some fashion, as opposed to actually trying to help them in some way. And that's really what it's about. My dad, who worked in business his entire career, used to say that business is about solving people's problems. And arguably, I mean, that's not just a UX statement, which someone could clearly make. That's the whole concept of business. It's about trying to help someone with something. And I think we've lost a lot of that. Right now, it's more about businesses trying to manipulate people to do what you want them to do.
That's true too. And also what I think I have found, and many people tend to agree, but even if you don't, that's okay. But I find a lot of people also agree that we're supposed to be solving people's problems, but we're not doing the right research to understand those problems. And we're instead making assumptions about those problems. And I'll give you a quick example from Larry Marine, who's a UX practitioner I admire greatly out in Denver. And he has a case study of a project he worked on when he worked for, I think it was Pro Flowers many years ago. And when flower shops first got online, like Pro Flowers, 1-800-Flowers, FTD, it was basically pick a bouquet or put together a bouquet. But when he started doing research and he went into flower shops and watched how people behaved, and so he was doing offline and online research because that's his specialty, is really understanding the problems. And of course, flower websites want to sell more. So they thought, oh, more flowers, more options. But what he found was that people who came into flower shops really didn't understand what any particular flower meant or what flower looked good with any other flower. They understood the occasion. I need something for this reason. And when he redesigned Pro Flowers website to ask you to choose flowers by occasion, their sales went crazy. And their sales stayed crazy, and everybody else copied them. And we could have tried to just build that slightly better e-commerce system. We could have laid out the page a little bit differently. We could have said, people are not buying as many flowers as they should. Let's try another sale. But what Larry does, and what we all should be doing, is taking that time to do that research, observing customers, speaking to customers, and learning, wait a minute, nobody knows poop about flowers. They don't want to shop by bouquet or whatever that is. They want to shop by the meaning, the occasion, the reason. And that's the example that I give. We can have empathy all day long for customers and buying flowers, and we can say business is in the business of solving problems. But if we are not taking that time to do that research, which doesn't have to be months anymore, it can be weeks, it could be months. Doing that research to learn what people's problems even are. Sometimes I see BS posted around LinkedIn like, you can solve customers' problems without even fully understanding the problem. Dr. Seth Finkle, psychologist, can you solve a problem you don't fully understand?
Maybe by accident, but no. I mean, it's certainly not a very efficient process. I agree.
And we got a comment in the room that I forgot to mention really quickly from our point before this. Our good friend Lee from Akathame said, that's the key. If you're a person who doesn't really care what others think or feel, empathy doesn't come natural and it comes across disingenuous. Some might argue Steve Jobs wasn't empathetic, but he somehow got people to use technology. Thank you, Lee.
Absolutely. So, I mean, arguably, one of the differences between your business and mine is that in the end, it's a question of what you do with that empathy. In my business, it looks a little different. In your business, I'm gonna give you an example as well from the UX world, of bad CX, right? So you're on the phone, you're calling your insert company here, and what you hear is, in addition to some really bad music, you hear, your call is important to us. Please
Your
stay on the
call is
line.
very important to us. Please
Right,
stay on the line. It'll be answered as soon as possible.
right.
Ba-doop,
And I
boop,
mean,
ba-doop, boop.
how many people believe that? Like, I'm going to
Right.
tell you right off the bat, any person who has an IQ of at least 60 knows that's bullshit. Your
Oh my
call,
God, my call is so important to them.
right. Like, clearly my call is not important, or you would have answered my call. And second of all, if I
Right.
stay on the line, my call may or may not be answered in the order in which it was received, but certainly it's not going to be answered shortly, or you wouldn't bother to tell me this. You would simply put me on hold for 10 seconds and then answer. That, I think, that's a great example of how not to use empathy, right? The idea is, we know that people are frustrated on the phone. We can sense that, and we want to do something about that. And so we've decided the best way to do it is to just acknowledge that it's frustrating by simply saying, we're going to let them know, no, it's important. You're important. You are not just a person in a queue waiting to be responded to by someone who may or may not understand your problem and may or may not be able to solve your problem. You may need to escalate it through 35 other people before you finally get some kind of response, which may or may not be a useful response. And meanwhile, you had to press buttons and deal with 1,000,001 menus before you reach this point. By this point, most people have already pulled out their hair and they start to look like me.
That's not how that happened.
That's a bad example of empathy. Like, that's not how empathy is supposed to work. But somehow
Right.
that's the way we do it. Like, that's such a truism. Everyone's had that experience.
And the other day I called a company, and it was a company I'd never called before, and it was like, ring. So there's one ring, and then all of a sudden this guy goes, "Hi, thank you for calling blah blah blah. My name is blah blah blah. Hey, what are you calling about today?" And I was like, that was a live person in an American in America, like, or at least America, on the first ring.
Right.
And many companies are capable of that. Not everybody wants to staff up to that level, but I called the California DMV also last week. I know you're thinking you're jealous. Deb called the
I am.
California DMV. And it was, we anticipate your hold time will be 42 minutes. And it was 50 something minutes. And I stayed on hold. I walked the dog. I came back. Because I called from my computer to get the Wi-Fi. I left the computer on, walked the dog, came back. The DMV lady was super friendly and helpful and nice. That was a beautiful experience. But the 50-minute wait, I thought we're supposed to have systems that analyze these things and say, oh, we better shift some of our resources.
Right. But arguably, and we could probably get bogged down in the call center thing, but honestly, I mean, part of it too is there's other ways to solve that problem. One is to tell someone how long their wait is, which is useful because then at least you can plan accordingly. You can put down the phone. If you don't know, then that's of no use to you. If you're told, we'll get to you soon, and it's 50 minutes later, that's a complete failure.
Yeah.
Also, you could have we'll call you back in, as soon as someone is available, give us a number and say your name now, and then they'll actually make the return call. I love that. That's a terrific service. But in the end, someone had to think about that and say, this is something that our users might appreciate, because this is a really frustrating experience that might potentially keep someone from using this service, unless that's the whole point, is that they don't want people calling, in which case make it as frustrating as possible. I get that.
That's the dark pattern.
Right. But if you're trying to really help people, and by the way, just to be empathic towards, because I know you have a number of viewers and listeners who are not Americans in America, I have no problem with outsourcing. So if I'm calling and I'm getting someone from another country who is able to answer my problem or my question, and I've had a number of them, God bless you. That's fantastic. I'm glad for anybody anywhere on the planet who can help me out. But I will
That is
say,
true. I shouldn't have made it sound like I only want to talk to Americans in America. That's not true. I would just say because from being American, I sometimes feel like, oh my God, there's so many Americans out of work.
sure,
Could we have hired some Americans here before we sent it somewhere else? And that's just a little bit of wanting to see my friends get jobs.
absolutely, absolutely. And sometimes part of it is, quite frankly, it's a question of the linguistic capacity of the person you're talking to. And there are times where, no matter where someone's from, whether they could be in America, their English is poor. That's probably not the best person to be working at a call center. Um, that's a staffing issue, but yeah, I mean, the bottom line is these all have an impact on the end user,
Customer experience.
on me, and I appreciate when someone's put the time and energy into making my experience a more pleasant one and a more functional one. That's to me about being compassionate, and that's the company that I'm likely to stick around with.
Yeah, or you're calling the California DMV and you have no choice. But luckily, that woman was helpful and accurate, so that was really helpful. Bringing this back to some of the stuff that I have in my notes that I wanted to talk about,
Yep.
what we find a lot in UX is that there's a lot of movements right now to try to cut time in what UX is working on. That surely, UX, some people think that's bloated, it's a time waster, it's a budget waster. Come on, can't we just all sit in front of a whiteboard and sketch something and call it a product? And there's a lot of movements and models right now that are trying to get people to work faster and to do things with more compressed timeframes. And a couple of these models are suggesting, research, it's bloated, it's expensive, it takes time. Just work from your guesses and assumptions. I'm sorry, I hear something strange outside my door.
Huh.
That was just a weird moment. So I was surprised. I'm always surprised by this because and Lee is hold on, we've got a couple of comments here. Um Let's see, it costs more to employ humans than technology or business leaders think. Yet, what is the cost in lost customers, the tech support to maintain the system, upgrades, etc.? From Lee, to upgrades in technology in the void of empathy unless it improves efficiencies. That's it. And Lee says, even then, technology can't possibly equal human empathy or care. That's another reason why I'm not a big fan of chatbots, because I find that the problem with chatbots is that they're trying to emulate a human conversation, but they are not even coming close.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Uh, so
there's so
quick, a
few
quick note
out
on
there that can
chatbots.
really
Go
do
ahead.
that. Yeah, no, so my yeah, this is a rabbit hole I probably won't go down, but yes, agreed that chatbots have always come short in terms of passing the Turing test, the ability to determine whether something is actually human or machine. There are some humans who frankly don't pass the Turing test, who come across as more machine than human. But there's very few machines that can really do a good job of emulating a person because our brains just work in a much more complicated way. And the way we communicate with each other is much more
And even if
nuanced.
they can't emulate a human, they're not even solving our problems in many cases, and they're just
Exactly.
adding another layer of frustration. I tell people if your chatbot reminds people of the phone system they hate calling into, you haven't, congratulations, you used a new technology, but you haven't really solved people's problems, which we have to keep
Exactly.
coming back to. So my point before I read Lee's comment and before I heard something outside my door, which turned out to be my own computer, what I was talking about was how we're seeing this shift in UX, and I hope it's just a temporary mistake, where people are saying just go with your guesses and assumptions. You'll figure out later if you were right or not. When we release this to the public, we'll figure out if our guesses and assumptions were right, or we'll make a guess and assumption now. Debbie will do a whole bunch of architecture and design, and then we'll test it on people, and we'll see if our guesses and assumptions were right. And my thought, and we're showing empathy for people because we know what they think, we know how they're feeling, and I feel like this has been really dangerous for my industry. You may not be able to comment on my industry, but as a consumer of these things, I'm sure you are not happy to hear this is how meetings are going behind closed doors.
I'm not surprised though. I mean, certainly from a consumer experience, I have to say that that's not shocking at all.
That's how it
I,
feels.
exactly. I mean, I would counter by saying, why beta test? Why bother? Just put something together and run it out there and see how it works. And if it runs into the ground, then we scrap it. I mean, if you really believe in something, arguably it might not be the most efficient thing to do to actually test it and make sure it works first. But arguably that would not be a dumb thing to do. Like, why test new drugs? We kind of sort of think it should work. Let's just put it out there, and if it works, then great. And if people get killed in the process, well, you got to break a few eggs to make an omelet. I mean, the question is, how much do you actually care about the people who are using your goods and services? If you give a crap about them, they'll feel that, and they'll be more likely to be retained as customers, and probably more likely to live, if you're selling drugs. So I would
Or
say,
airplanes.
or frankly anything that you depend on.
Yeah.
So I think I get it. I understand that in a tough financial market, everybody's got to trim. I totally understand that. And it's all about efficiency and about how few minutes can you spend on something and get the best return on your time investment. Okay, sure, to a point. But there's a point at which, every minute that you're taking away from it is a minute that you're cheating the end user from a more positive experience. And while there's, you can argue that you could take it to either extreme. You could bloat it out and spend, 40 years producing a product that theoretically you could have done in about, 6 months. Yeah, that would be ridiculous. But you could also put something out in 6 months that probably should have taken a year. And arguably, you're going to feel the consequences of that. You're going to have problems. And those problems may or may not be resolvable in a way that's going to maintain a good user base.
Yeah, that's where I remind people that we have to calculate the cost of our risk, and we have to calculate the cost to undo things, because not everything can be undone, and not everything can be undone simply, easily, quickly. And if people who check back a few podcast episodes ago, I did the Delta CX decision matrix, which helps people calculate some of this risk and some perspective on this stuff, if people want to check back on that podcast. But I really want to impress upon people just how can we bring this back to empathy if people are guessing and assuming about customers. If another stakeholder or manager or leader at a company is saying, we don't have time for research, we don't want to spend money on research, we know our customers, we know what they want, we know what they need, we've been doing this for 20 years, look how successful we are, just go with your best guesses and assumptions, you're an expert, right? Is that still empathy? Is that cognitive empathy? Is that emotional empathy? Is that empathy at all?
Right. I mean, it makes a number.
I'm asking you.
It makes a number of dangerous assumptions. It might be empathy if you're talking about a group of, I don't know, let's say 25 people as your customer base, and you interact with them on a regular basis, and you do have a pretty good handle on what they want. But even then, I mean, so in a relationship, arguably, you don't say, well, I know what you needed from me, 10 years ago, so I know what you need from me now, and I'm not going to ask. Like, why would you do that? That's ridiculous.
I have a real life story that sounds like that. Now I need you as my therapist.
I think most of us do. I mean, that's the whole idea, is that things change over time. People change, relationships change, needs change. So to say, well, I know what you needed back then, so now I know what you need now as a customer, that's preposterous. That you might have a totally different customer base than you think you do. And you'll never know that if you don't take the time to ask. You might be right. So great. Do at least a cursory job of trying to figure out whether you're test that theory. Am I correct in saying that I'm an expert on this and I know what I'm talking about? Do at least some kind of pilot to figure out whether or not you're still on track. Don't just wash your hands of it and say, we know our people and we know what we're doing and we don't need to check anymore. That's dangerous.
And And that's what goes on. So I want to point you, and thanks for being willing to stay a little bit over the hour. I don't want to go too
Sure.
long or this becomes a small audiobook, but I wanted to talk about an article that I saw that I did send you already. And this was how to encourage workplace empathy.
Mhm.
This was actually found on the Forbes website. And I want to quickly read people what it says are the ways, 15 proven strategies to encourage workplace empathy without crossing individual boundaries. So, just to list them out quickly, I'm going to read them. Number one, communicate and encourage. Number two, infuse employee feedback in decisions. Number three, make emotional intelligence part of your DNA. Number four, add empathy to the weekly team agenda. Number five, use the DISC assessment. I don't know that one. Number six, emphasize that we're on the same team. Number seven, give people a sense of purpose. Number eight, strive to lead by example. Number nine, give people options. Number 10, allow room for more cross pollination. Number 11, share diverse and inspiring stories. Number 12, have regular check ins. Number 13, establish trust as a social norm. Number 14, promote innovation. And number 15, incorporate self assessments in your annual review. Now, I think most of those are probably good business team managerial ideas in general, but I know I didn't ask you this first as you were listening to them, but you saw the article. Did any of these strike you as being related to empathy?
Not directly. No, I agree with you. I would say they strike me as pretty sound, generally speaking, pretty sound business practice. They may inadvertently build empathy because honestly, the more you are creating a culture of trying to, to use a somewhat dated term in the workplace nowadays, but there's a kind of norm in the workplace environment that paying attention to other people's feelings is important and responding to those feelings appropriately is important. I honestly think there's value to that no matter what. And I do think that you do sort of create a kind of inadvertent empathy, at least in your work environment, by focusing on things like 360 evaluations and getting constant feedback and giving constant feedback and making that okay and not just a source of feeling criticized or a fuel for defensiveness. Giving people a place to speak and feel heard. I think in theory, those are all excellent ideas. But no, in terms of will that generate, is that the machine that's going to generate empathy, which then we can bottle and use? And I don't think it quite works like that.
Yeah, like this says, add empathy to the weekly team agenda. The weekly meetings start with each colleague quickly sharing how they're feeling at work and then diving into the work itself. Swear words coming, but can you imagine having a meeting and saying, let's start with how everybody's feeling at work? And I go, well, I'm fucking useless. I don't understand why you hired me. You won't let me do my job. I mean, like, so I feel like some of these are potentially unrealistic when we think we're going to use them to create empathy. Number 6, emphasize that we're on the same team. What was happening before that people were not clear that we're on the same team?
Right. Yeah, I mean, again, as a general practice, it's not a bad idea to continually bring that home to everyone that we're working towards a common goal and to try to figure out ways of giving specific examples of that so that you can keep everyone working on the same page. But to try to introduce these, as the article seems to suggest, like the feeling I get is that I'm sitting there, I'm a manager, and I'm looking at my, or a CEO or something like that. I'm reading this and I'm thinking, my workplace empathy level sucks. What am I going to do about that? Oh, here's some handy little things I can try next Tuesday. I don't think that's going to be your thing. If you haven't been
Hey,
doing
everybody, how are you feeling at work? It's new. We're going to do it every day.
yeah, like I can't imagine for the life of me that ending well. I would say if you're not already doing those things, please don't start them abruptly next Tuesday. That's going to be bad.
Or in a group meeting. If you really want to know how I feel,
right,
maybe this is a one-on-one meeting.
right, right. Yeah. So I agree with you. It's a misguided attempt to try to do warm, fuzzy, kind of soft stuff in the work environment and try to introduce it. I think if you're doing it all along, it's a great idea to continue to focus on that and to build that into everything you do to make that the norm. But you can't create. So many companies try to do this. I've worked in several of them where they actually try to create a norm on a Thursday. They're like, okay, we're going to do this thing now. This is this is our new workplace environment that we're starting at 4:15
On
we're
Thursday.
just going to abruptly put it in place, and everyone's going to do it, and we'll all live happily ever after. That would be a company to run away from, because clearly they live in a different planet than the rest of us. That's not how humans work. You have to introduce things in a little more gradual fashion than that, and arguably, you have to really mean it. If you don't really mean it, you can fake it as much as you like. Everyone's going to see through that crap, and they're going to know right away they're just trying to manipulate me.
Right. And nobody wants the person to come back to work after a couple of days at a conference and hear them say, I got a certificate. I'm now an empathy trainer, or, I'm an empathy workshop facilitator, and now I want us to practice defending opposing viewpoints, or I want us to really healthfully express our emotions at work. I mean, there's so many of these certificates and workshops and trainings, and I could express all the feelings I have, but that doesn't change that there's something I need to build for our customers that requires us to understand what the customers need and have done actual research with them. And then it requires us to take action rather than making the same old excuses of, they're fine with what we already built, or just put it out there. They'll figure it out. And actually, to add to something you said before about why even beta test it, I remind people like, hey, you really want to cut down time? Stop doing software QA, which are the
Right.
people who check the code for bugs before it goes out to the public. Because in the old days, the programmers wrote code, it went out to the public. The public were like, what are all these crappy bugs? And they said, oh, we better put in these people here to check for bugs. I tell people that UX, and especially UX testing and all the aspects of CX, are really about checking for bugs before engineers even build it, before we waste their time. Quick reminder, we are running over for everybody, but if you guys have any questions, please ask them. Otherwise, we'll be wrapping up soon. We are on a 30 to 60-second delay, so I'll wait a minute or so to see if any other questions come in. But this is the bizarre world in which I live, Seth. People are having design thinking exercises where you can show empathy for the customer by imagining, guessing, assuming what their journey is as they try to use your product or go through a task. So the task might
Right.
be booking a hotel. Where do they start? Well, maybe they don't start on your company's website. Maybe they start in a search or something else. We do, so part of UX, we do these customer journey maps to show the map out the process. But I find that there are exercises that are saying, we'll show empathy for customers by making a customer journey map, but they don't mention that they're guessing at the customer journey map. Nobody interviewed the customers or watched them, and it's breaking my heart every day.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Well, so in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but there is in practice. And so if you're the customer and you're in a particular brick and mortar store, or you're on a particular machine, and your brick and mortar store or your laptop isn't the same as the one that is so nice that they're using in the corporate office, right? Or the one that's around the corner from the corporate office, or the fancy desktop that's running, 8 cores and stuff like that. It's going to be a different experience, and that's the whole concept. Is it's going to be a different experience. My Windows machine tells me what my Windows experience number is based on how crappy my machine is. It's generally trying to get me to buy a better one, but it understands, at least, or it seems to understand, that there's an experience as an end user of how I'm going to use this that's going to be different from what yours is going to look like. So whether you're talking about kind of the UX, kind of techie side of it, or you're talking about kind of the CX, I don't even know if that's a real distinction, but the sort of consumer, I'm going into a store, I'm doing something that's ultimately consuming something. Those experiences for me, based on what my morning was like, based on you know, what my connectivity, my bandwidth is like, what my, you know, the people who are the other clientele in the store, or the demographics of the folks and the level of education and training of the folks who are actually staffing the store, it's going to look different. And so for someone to kind of suppose what my experience is going to be from on high in a corporate office somewhere, I guarantee you it's not going to be correct. But of
Yeah, I'm
course,
just
we're on the
thinking,
same page of
sorry,
music
all
on
my,
that.
yeah, my brain is just spinning. Anyone watching the video back will be like, is Deb daydreaming? I'm just like, 47,000 things I want to say, and we're already running over time, so I should wrap up. But I think that I'm going to ask you this. I'm going to put my thought out there. Empathy is being thrown around in my industry as a buzzword. Show empathy, create empathy, have empathy for the customer. We're trying to have enterprise empathy, and there's so much. If you saw it, it would make you cry. I want to replace that word with something that's more meaningful, because I feel like empathy has now even lost its meaning. What does it
Mhm.
mean? Even if it's perspective taking, so what? You took someone's perspective, you imagined what their experience was like. Now what? And I feel like the word that I want to replace it with, and maybe you've got a better one, is action. I
Yeah.
feel like whether or not you understood the other person's experience, whether or not you felt for them, whether or not you took the perspective of the customers, whether or not you had sympathy for the customers, whether or not you genuinely felt the feelings customers are feeling in your body, I don't care at this point. Just take action.
Mhm.
Do the research, design something better. Take the action and stop congratulating yourself for having really looked through the customer's eyes.
So I
What's a
would
better word than empathy?
yeah, I would caution you, because I think there is a kind of organizational impulsivity that we've been talking about. The idea that organizations don't want to take the time and energy to do the feeling part and just kind of want to do something. And so they may be jumping right into action. You may mean action very differently than a company might.
You're
I would be
right.
thinking about the
Not the
word,
best word.
I'm thinking about the word compassion,
Hmm.
which ultimately, you know, comes from the idea of feeling pain with someone else. And it's not just the feeling of pain with someone else, that's more of the empathy part, but it's the doing something about it part. Compassion is the feeling plus the action, right? It's the idea that I need to do something to help this person. Um, and that's kind of the missing, I'm not sure what the word is exactly, but I think that's the idea, is it's the coupling of, um, at the worst, presumption, or at the best, maybe a realization of the person's experience, and an attempt to try then to do something to help that person. That's the thing that cuts through both of our professions. It's about recognizing someone else's experience and then trying to do something to improve it. And that's, you can't do that by guessing. You have to do that by interacting, and you have to do it by taking action. I agree with you. Those are the two critical pieces that seem to be getting left out.
Yeah, maybe then I can, I like your compassion. Maybe I can upgrade mine. I think I've got to make it two words. I want to make it knowledge, and then I want to make it action, because I
Hmm.
think we need to start differentiating, at least in my business, the difference between what do we think, guess, or assume, and what do we know.
Absolutely.
What do we know from studies, research, data, primary research, secondary research, recent research, research we did last year, customers we just brought in, customers we observed? What do we know, And what action can we take because of what we know? I'm going to need to make up a word that combines those two. I'll get back to you on that.
Yeah. So in terms of selling this to the organization and trying to help them, because I know that's an ongoing issue in your world.
Yeah.
There's an old cliche that used to hang on walls in office spaces back when they had those inspirational things on walls on a
Hang
regular
in
basis.
there.
Yes, exactly. And this one was just as cheesy, and it brings the bile up in the same way. It's you only get one chance to make a good first impression.
I actually use that in my talks. You never
There you
get a
go.
second chance to make a first impression. That was also like a dandruff shampoo commercial.
I think it was. Yeah, it was. It was a buzz. It was a tagline, but it's true, and that's
Yeah.
the whole idea. Is that as a consumer, I know that in my bones to be true. That if you screw me the first time around as a company, I will not be back. And if it happens
Unless you're
inadvertently,
Facebook.
right. I'm still not back to Facebook. If it happens inadvertently that you screw me, it depends on how compassionate a person
How
I
you
am.
handle it.
But chances are pretty good I'm not going to give you a whole lot more second chances to fix it. And you may or may not get a second chance from almost any other consumer. Most people are going to say, why in the world should I come back to you? You're supposed to be doing something for me. So
I
if the
want to
company
throw
isn't
in,
doing that,
go
that's a
ahead.
problem.
Yeah, and I wanted to throw in something a friend of mine brought up on LinkedIn a few weeks ago, and I kind of want to make it a movement, but you know me, I got a lot of movements I'm working on here in the UX world. My friend Oz Du Soleil, who actually mostly works in training people on Microsoft Excel, has lots of courses people can buy. He's great. And he, as a consumer, is beyond frustrated. He's angry, and he's right. And he was talking about how hard it can sometimes be for him to find decent customer service, customer support. Why is it even broken or hard to do in the first place? And he said, you know what? I think from now on, in as many cases as possible, I'm going to let it stay broken. He said, oh, Camtasia doesn't like its own codec and it wants me to go download another codec. No, that can stay broken.
Hmm.
And I wanted to start a movement, hashtag let it stay broken, because I love the idea. Like, his thought was if the company isn't going to build this right in the first place or have done proper testing to not make me the guinea pig
Yeah.
or the victim, you know what? I'm not even going to fix it for you. I'm not going to patch it up. He's like, I am so tired of reading online help things that tell you go call the company or uninstall it and reinstall it. He was saying, let it stay broken. And a lot of people ask me, Deb, how do I create change at my company? How do I do this? And I say, they're not going to change until they feel more pain. And you get more customers like you and me and Oz. And I think people are getting there. Standards are raising and companies are going to feel that pain. I believe most companies are feeling this pain, but won't admit it, or nobody's calculating it. Sales might say, gee, sales seem down this quarter. But like nobody's saying, wow, we suck. We're really messing this up. Only when it gets to a breaking point where I've been called by companies who say, you have to help us redesign our entire system. Sales can't sell it to anyone anymore, and customers are leaving. Now you're at a breaking point. Now I need months or a year to do this project, to redesign the entire system that nobody's looked at in 10 years. We have to be more proactive and stop waiting for stuff to be on fire.
I agree. I think so. Yes, for sure. The whole idea of do it right the first time and you wouldn't be in this mess makes a whole lot of sense to me. And I do think that should be a mantra. I think if a company decides that they're ready or an organization decides that they're ready to really fix a problem, then as far as I'm concerned, I don't know that it needs to stay broken in my mind. I could see if they're truly committed to doing something right and they're not just going to slap a patch on it, then as far as I'm concerned, if you're going to put the time and the energy and the money into doing it right and fixing the problem and rebooting, now it's a 2.0, great, do it. If you're going to ultimately say, we're just going to keep throwing fixes at this and try to do it in the cheapest, most, kind of corner cutting way possible.
More help files, more knowledge base.
Right. You know what? Like, how many times have we, so out of curiosity, when you're looking at a help file on a website, and I suspect you might have seen one or two in your day, and it
Yeah, like
asks,
yesterday.
and it asks you, was this helpful? Yes or no? Do you check those?
I do.
I
Not
do too.
100% of the time, but and my favorites are the ones that then give you little box that say, well, what could we improve? My
Right.
not favorite ones are the ones that just go, thanks for your answer. And then I go, oh, that's no difference than I just went through airport security. I'm hitting happy face or sad face. Like you have the quantitative of how many people felt a certain way, but you don't know why. You don't know what went wrong. And that's supposed to signal us to spin up more CX and UX research.
Exactly. And instead, what it does is it tells the end user, because we presume that they're not going to do that, because most companies don't do that nowadays. I'm not stupid. As an end user, I know that when I press no, that was an unhelpful response, and it says, thank you for your response, that's the computer giving me the finger.
Yes, that is the finger for sure. I totally agree. Oh God. I should let you go. You've got the day off. It's 18 Fahrenheit out, which has to be like negative 400 Celsius. I don't know how to translate that for our friends around the world. I shouldn't keep you all day, though I could. This will be the longest podcast. It's now an audiobook. Seth, as always, thank you so much. I know we're planning
Thank
maybe
you.
one or more of these on some other topics. We've had some people ask us to talk about managing workplace change
Yep.
or inspiring workplace change. So if you guys have a topic you want to hear super psychologist Seth and I talk about, send me a note on LinkedIn or YouTube, and we will put it in our collective hats and spin something up for you when Seth's got another day off.
Indeed.
Seth, thank you eternally. Always fun.
Thank
And
you. It's always a pleasure.
no, thank you. I need a few seconds to end the stream correctly. I've received feedback I'm not ending the streams correctly. So thank you again. And let's see, I will end the stream and see everybody soon. Remember to check deltacx.com for all of my adventures.